The emergency lights flickered like dying fireflies in the cold corridors of Carroll Station. 3 flashes, then darkness. 2 flashes, then darkness. The rhythm had become as familiar to Marcus as his own heartbeat. It was the station's death throes, stretched across months instead of moments. Marcus moved through the dimly lit passageway, his footsteps echoing against metal walls that had once hummed with life. Now they stood silent, save for the occasional groan of settling metal or the hiss of an oxygen leak somewhere in the vast network of corridors. The air tasted stale on his tongue, recycled too many times through failing systems. "System check. Emergency Bay 4, he muttered to himself, pressing his palm against the sensor panel. The door slid open with a reluctant screech, revealing his living quarters, once an emergency medical bay, now converted into a sparse home. Home was a generous term for the sterile space. A cot salvaged from the med bay, a workbench cluttered with tools and half-repaired circuitry, and a small hydroponic garden that struggled to produce enough food to supplement his dwindling rations. The walls, once white, had yellowed with age and neglect. Everything within Carroll Station was past its prime, hanging on by threads of engineering that Marcus struggled daily to maintain. He checked the oxygen levels on his wrist monitor. Another day, another slight decrease. The station's life support systems were failing incrementally, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the artificial atmosphere became too thin to sustain him. "Computer, begin emergency cycle," he commanded. "Emergency cycle initiated," replied the computer's voice, flat and emotionless. 16 hours until next station diagnostic. The station's clock no longer followed Earth's day-night cycle. Instead, it marked time by emergency protocols, maintenance schedules, and oxygen conservation periods. Day and night had become meaningless concepts aboard Carroll Station. There was only the red glow of emergency lighting, the blue flicker of computer terminals, and the occasional stark white of a medical scan. Marcus sat at his workbench and pulled apart a filtration component. His fingers, once soft from a life of intellectual pursuits, had become calloused and nimble from endless repairs. Before the evacuation, he'd been a chemical engineer and nutrition specialist, developing sustainable food systems for long-term space habitation. Now, he was a mechanic, electrician, plumber, and doctor, whatever the station needed him to be to survive one more cycle. He worked in silence, listening to the irregular rhythm of the station's breathing, the wheeze of air recyclers, the gurgle of water purification systems, the click of failing temperature regulators. When he'd chosen to stay behind during the final evacuation, he hadn't anticipated the crushing weight of solitude, the absence of human voices, the lack of footsteps other than his own. 16 months alone, with only the station's dying systems for company. The silence had become a living thing, a presence that followed him through empty corridors and abandoned laboratories. At first, he'd filled it with his own voice, talking to himself, singing old songs, reciting poetry he'd memorized in school. Eventually, even that had faded. Words became precious resources, used sparingly, like oxygen and water. Marcus finished his repairs and moved to his cot. Sleep was another resource to be managed carefully. 6 hours, no more, no less. Just enough to function without wasting precious time that could be spent maintaining the station's vital systems. He closed his eyes, letting the familiar sounds of the station lull him toward unconsciousness. The soft whir of air filters, the distant ping of a leak detection system, the irregular heartbeat of emergency lights. Knock, knock. Marcus's eyes snapped open. He lay perfectly still, certain he'd imagined the sound. 16 months alone had taught him that the mind plays tricks when starved of companionship. Knock, knock. This time, there was no mistaking it. A deliberate sound. Not the random clanking of failing machinery or the groan of the station's hull. This was purposeful, controlled, human. Or at least, Something intelligent enough to knock. Marcus sat up, heart hammering against his ribs. Station protocol was clear. During emergency cycles, all compartments remained sealed. No exceptions. Opening doors unnecessarily wasted precious oxygen and risked contamination. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was more urgent now, desperate. Marcus's hands trembled as he reached for the manual override panel beside his door. Every instinct screamed at him to ignore the sound, to follow protocol, to protect himself and the fragile ecosystem he'd maintained for survival. But 16 months of solitude had left a hollow space inside him that protocol couldn't fill. His fingers hovered over the emergency release. Once pressed, it couldn't be undone. The compartment would equalize with the corridor outside, sharing his precious air with whoever waited beyond. Knock, knock. Computer, identify presence outside emergency bay 4, Marcus commanded, his voice hoarse from disuse. Unable to comply. External sensors in Sector 4 Alpha are non-functional, the computer replied, its tone unchanged by the extraordinary circumstances. Of course they were. Half the station's sensors had failed months ago, and he'd prioritized life support over surveillance. One more knock, softer this time, almost pleading. Marcus pressed the emergency release. The door slid open with a rush of escaping air, and Marcus found himself face to face with a nightmare. A figure stood in the doorway, naked and trembling. Female in form, but clearly not human. Her skin was a pale bluish gray, covered in intricate markings that might have been tattoos or natural patterns, where a human would have hair. She had delicate tendrils that moved slightly, as if in an unfelt breeze. Her eyes, large and entirely black, reflected the emergency lights like obsidian mirrors. A Vathari, one of the alien refugees who had been seeking asylum across the solar system before the war, before the evacuation, before everyone left. She swayed slightly, bracing herself against the doorframe. Her body was a map of suffering, protruding ribs, hollow cheeks, and a network of scars across her shoulders and back that spoke of violence and cruelty. Her black eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made him step back involuntarily. Every protocol, every training scenario, every emergency directive told him to seal the door, to protect himself, to maintain the station's integrity. Instead, he stepped aside. "Come in," he said, his voice cracking from disuse. The Vathari hesitated, her tendrils curling tightly against her skull, a sign of fear or uncertainty. Marcus couldn't tell. Then, with a graceful movement that belied her weakened state, she stepped into his quarters. The door slid shut behind her with a hiss of equalizing pressure. For a long moment, they stood in silence, two survivors in a dead station, regarding each other with equal parts hope and trepidation. "Computer, emergency cycle override. Increase oxygen flow to emergency bay 4 by 15%, Marcus commanded, not taking his eyes off the visitor. "Override accepted. Oxygen levels increasing. Warning, this action will decrease overall station reserves by 2.3% per cycle." A price worth paying, Marcus decided, watching as the Vathari's breathing eased slightly. He moved slowly toward a storage compartment, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "I'm going to get you something," he explained, though he wasn't sure she understood his language. Clothes, warmth. The Vathari watched him, with those unfathomable black eyes, tracking his every movement but making no sound. When he returned with a thermal blanket and a spare jumpsuit, she accepted them with trembling hands. Her fingers, longer than human fingers, with an extra joint, brushed against his, sending an electric shock of contact through his system. 16 months without touching another living being had made his skin hypersensitive. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders first, clutching it tightly, as if afraid it might be taken away. The jumpsuit she examined carefully, turning it over in her hands, before looking at Marcus with a question in her eyes. "It's all I have," he said apologetically. "It'll be too big, but it's clean." After a moment's consideration, she nodded and began to dress, movements hampered by weakness and the blanket she refused to relinquish even momentarily. Marcus turned away, offering what privacy he could in the small compartment. When he turned back, she stood draped in his spare jumpsuit, the sleeves and legs rolled up multiple times to accommodate her smaller frame. The blanket remained wrapped around her shoulders like a shield. "Are you hungry?" Marcus asked, already moving toward his meager food stores. He didn't wait for an answer before preparing a portion of protein paste and hydroponic greens. His own ration, but he'd manage without. He placed the food on his workbench and gestured for her to sit on the only stool. The Vathari approached cautiously, her movements fluid despite her weakness. She examined the food with the same careful scrutiny she'd given the clothing, then looked up at Marcus. "It's safe," he assured her. "For Vathari. I think it's basic proteins and carbohydrates, nothing species-specific." After a moment's hesitation, she began to eat, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as her body recognized nourishment. Marcus watched, leaning against the wall to give her space. Questions crowded his mind, fighting for priority. Where had she come from? How had she survived on the station? Why was she alone? But he asked none of them. The silence between them felt fragile, like ice just beginning to form over dark water. Words might shatter it, sending them both plunging into depths neither was prepared to navigate. So they existed in that silence as the emergency lights continued their erratic rhythm. 3 flashes, then darkness. 2 flashes, then darkness. The Vathari ate, and Marcus watched, and for the first time in 16 months, the station felt less like a tomb. When she finished eating, the Vathari carefully placed the utensil beside the empty container and looked up at Marcus. Her tendrils had relaxed somewhat, flowing more naturally around her face. "Thank you," she said, her voice a soft, melodic sound that seemed to resonate in the air longer than it should. Marcus startled, not expecting her to speak, much less in his language. "You're welcome," he replied automatically, the social niceties of a forgotten world resurfacing from muscle memory. "I am Sela," she continued, each word carefully formed as if she was recalling a language long unused. "Marcus," he offered in return, the sound of his own name strange in his ears after so long without using it. Sela nodded, accepting this exchange of identities as sufficient for now. Her black eyes moved around the compartment, taking in the stark functionality of his living space. "Safe here?" she asked, her tendrils curling slightly with the question. Marcus considered lying, considered offering the comfort of false security. But 16 months of solitude had stripped away his capacity for social niceties. "Safer than out there," he answered honestly. "But the station is dying. Life support is failing. I've been stretching it out, but—" He trailed off, unwilling to voice the inevitable conclusion. Sela nodded, apparently unsurprised by this assessment. "Dying everywhere," she said simply, her hand unconsciously moving to a particularly vivid scar on her collarbone, visible above the neckline of the jumpsuit. That simple gesture told Marcus more than hours of explanation could have. Whatever horrors had befallen the evacuation fleet, whatever chaos had engulfed the refugees, Sela had survived it, but not without cost. "You can stay," Marcus said, the words emerging before he'd fully formed the thought. "As long as you need to. As long as the station lasts." Sela's tendrils rippled in what might have been surprise or relief. "Gratitude," she said, the word holding a formal weight that suggested it was more than a casual thanks. Marcus nodded, uncomfortable with her intensity. He gestured toward the cot. "You should rest. Take the bed, I'll—" He looked around the small compartment, realizing for the first time how limited his space was for sharing. "I'll make something." Sella shook her head, her tendrils swaying with the movement. Share, she suggested, then clarified. Take turns. You sleep first. I watch. Marcus wanted to protest, to insist that she needed rest more than he did. But the determined set of her shoulders stopped him. This was not just an offer. It was a need to contribute, to establish herself as more than a burden, a need he recognized intimately from his own desperate attempts to maintain purpose during his long isolation. All right, he agreed. 4 hours. Then we switch. Sella nodded, satisfied with this arrangement. She moved to the workbench, perching on the stool as Marcus reluctantly settled onto his cot. Despite his exhaustion, he doubted he would sleep with a stranger, an alien stranger, watching over him. But the familiar sounds of the station, now accompanied by the soft, rhythmic breathing of another living being, lulled him into a deeper sleep than he'd experienced in months. He woke exactly 4 hours later, his internal clock as precise as the station's systems. Sella sat exactly where he'd left her, her posture unchanged, her black eyes fixed on the door as if expecting threats to materialize at any moment. Your turn, Marcus said, rising from the cot. Sella hesitated, then moved toward the bed with a wariness that suggested sleep was a vulnerability she was reluctant to surrender to. She sat on the edge of the cot, her back straight, her eyes still alert. I'll watch, Marcus assured her, taking her place at the workbench. Nothing will happen while you sleep. Another hesitation, then a slight nod. Sella lay down, her body tense, the thermal blanket pulled tightly around her despite the jumpsuit. Her black eyes remained open, fixed on the ceiling, her tendrils spread across the pillow like dark water. Marcus turned his attention to the workbench, deliberately making small noises as he sorted through components. Not enough to disturb, just enough to remind her of his presence, a consistent, non-threatening presence. It took nearly an hour before her breathing deepened and her tendrils relaxed, floating gently above the pillow as if suspended in liquid. Only then did Marcus allow himself to really look at her. In sleep, the wariness left her face, revealing a delicate structure that reminded him of ancient Terran sculptures, all elegant lines and perfect proportions, yet utterly alien. The markings on her skin seemed to shift slightly in the flickering emergency light, creating patterns that almost made sense before dissolving into beautiful chaos again. The Vithari had arrived on Earth nearly a decade ago, refugees from a dying world in a nearby system. They'd been welcomed at first, their advanced technology and peaceful demeanor making them valuable allies. But as resources grew scarce and Earth's own problems multiplied, welcome had turned to tolerance, then to suspicion, and finally to open hostility. The last Marcus had heard before the evacuation was that Vithari across the solar system were being relocated to designated facilities. The news had used words like protection and security, but the images that accompanied the reports, Vithari being herded into transport ships, separated from their communal groups, their tendrils lying flat against their skulls in distress, told a different story. Looking at Sella's scars, Marcus could guess what kind of protection those facilities had offered. He turned away, focusing again on his repairs. The filtration component needed a complete overhaul, but he'd been cannibalizing parts for so long that he had nothing suitable left. He'd have to find another approach, perhaps reconfigure the... They harvested us. Sella's voice, soft but clear, startled him. He turned to find her awake, those black eyes fixed on him with unsettling intensity. What? The humans. At the facility. Her hand moved again to the scar on her collarbone. They discovered that Vithari tissue regenerates quickly, that our organs can be transplanted into humans with minimal rejection. Her voice remained flat, emotionless, as if she were reciting facts from a scientific paper rather than describing atrocities. They harvested us, repeatedly. Marcus felt bile rise in his throat. "I didn't know," he whispered, the inadequacy of his response burning like acid in his mouth. "Most didn't," Sella acknowledged. "It was done in secret, special facilities, special personnel." Her tendrils rippled in what Marcus was beginning to recognize as a complex emotional expression. When the war came, when the evacuations began, they abandoned the facilities, left us locked in our cells. Marcus closed his eyes, imagining the horror of it, being left to die, trapped and helpless, as the world collapsed around you. "How did you escape?" he asked, opening his eyes to find her sitting up now, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "Others sacrificed," she said simply. "Created a distraction, a riot. I was small, could fit through maintenance ducts." Her tendrils drooped in what might have been sorrow or guilt. "I alone escaped." "And you came here, to Carroll Station?" Sella nodded. "Stowed aboard a supply ship. When it docked, I hid in the cargo bays, lived in the walls, the maintenance tunnels, took only what was abandoned or forgotten." Marcus tried to process this information. She'd been here, on the station, while he believed himself completely alone, hidden in the infrastructure, surviving on scraps, avoiding detection. "How long?" he asked. 342 cycles of the emergency lights. She answered precisely. "Nearly a year. A year of hiding, of scavenging, of complete isolation." It made his own ordeal seem almost luxurious by comparison. "Why show yourself now?" Sella's tendrils curled inward, a gesture Marcus couldn't interpret. "Air thinning, systems failing, hiding places becoming unsafe." She looked directly at him, her black eyes reflecting the emergency lights. "And loneliness. Watching you. I recognized it. The same emptiness. The same emptiness." The words echoed in Marcus's mind. A perfect description of the hollow space 16 months of solitude had carved inside him. An emptiness Sella's presence had already begun to fill, simply by giving him someone to care for, someone to talk to, someone to remind him he was still human. "You're safe here," he repeated his earlier assurance, meaning it more deeply now. "We'll find a way to survive, together." Sella's tendrils rippled in what might have been hope or skepticism. For how long? It was the question Marcus had been avoiding for months, as the station's systems failed one by one, and his temporary solutions became increasingly inadequate. "I don't know," he admitted, "but longer together than apart." This seemed to satisfy her. She nodded once, decisively, then rose from the cot with fluid grace. "I will help. Show me." And so began their partnership, a human engineer and a Vathari refugee working side by side to extend the life of a dying station. Sella's knowledge of the maintenance tunnels and hidden compartments proved invaluable, giving them access to resources Marcus had thought lost or inaccessible. Her smaller, more dexterous hands could reach components his could not, and her ability to withstand lower oxygen levels meant she could venture into areas of the station he couldn't safely access. In return, Marcus shared his technical knowledge, his food, and his living space. They established routines, divided tasks, and developed a system of communication that required few words. In the silence between them, a fragile trust began to grow. Days passed, measured in emergency cycles rather than sunrises and sunsets. They worked together during the station's artificial day periods, then retreated to Emergency Bay 4 during conservation cycles, taking turns sleeping on the cot while the other kept watch. Neither spoke of what they were watching for. The station was abandoned except for them, but the ritual provided comfort nonetheless. Slowly, Sella began to heal. The hollow places in her cheeks filled out as proper nutrition restored her strength. The wary tension in her shoulders eased somewhat, though it never fully disappeared. Her tendrils moved more freely, expressing complex emotions Marcus was gradually learning to interpret. And in her healing, Marcus found his own. The crushing weight of solitude lifted. The purpose that had sustained him, mere survival, expanded to include Sella's well-being. The silence that had been his constant companion for 16 months was now shared, transformed from a burden into a comfortable space between two beings who understood each other's need for quiet. It wasn't perfect. They had misunderstandings, moments of frustration or fear. Sella would sometimes retreat into herself, her tendrils lying flat against her skull, her black eyes distant and unseeing as memories claimed her. Marcus had his own demons, nightmares that left him gasping for breath, moments of irrational anger at equipment failures that threatened their precarious existence. But they weathered these storms together, finding in each other's presence an anchor against the chaos of their broken worlds. It was during one of the station's rare quiet periods, when all systems were functioning as well as could be expected, and no immediate crises demanded attention, that the pattern of their existence was shattered. The sound of the station-wide communication system, activating for the first time in months, froze them both in place. Sella at the workbench, Marcus beside his small hydroponic garden. Attention! This is station security. An unauthorized life sign has been detected in Emergency Bay 4. Preparing for entry and inspection. Stand by. Marcus's blood turned to ice. Station security. That meant the patrol teams were still active somewhere on the station. He'd assumed they'd all evacuated, or died when life support failed in their sectors. But apparently, some had survived, maintained their protocols, and were now coming for Sella. He looked at her, saw the terror in her eyes, the way her tendrils had flattened completely against her skull. She knew what it meant, too. Station security had been among the first to turn against non-human refugees when the crisis began. They'd been the ones to enforce the relocation orders, to separate Vathari from their communal groups, to treat them as resources rather than people. "Hide," Marcus said urgently, already moving toward a maintenance panel that would give Sella access to the walls where she'd survived for so long. "Get back into the tunnels. I'll tell them I'm alone, that the sensor is malfunctioning." Sella didn't move, her black eyes fixed on the door, her body rigid with fear. "Sella, please," Marcus begged, trying to keep his voice calm despite the panic rising in his chest. "They'll take you, or worse." "No more hiding," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "No more walls. No more darkness." Her tendrils rippled with determination or resignation. Marcus couldn't tell which. Face them. Together. Before Marcus could argue further, the compartment door slid open without warning or request for entry. Station security protocols overrode privacy concerns during emergencies, and apparently, an unauthorized life sign qualified. Two figures stood in the doorway, dressed in the dark uniforms of station security. One male, one female, both human, both armed with the standard-issue shock batons that security had used to maintain order during the evacuation. The female officer entered first, her eyes taking in the modified living space before fixing on Sella with cold assessment. "Unauthorized non-human presence confirmed," she said into her wrist communicator. "Vathari female, approximately 25 standard years. No identification visible." The male guard remained in the doorway, shock baton at the ready, eyes moving between Marcus and Sella as if assessing which was the greater threat. "This compartment has been flagged for unusual resource consumption," the officer continued, addressing Marcus now. "Oxygen usage increased by 15% over standard emergency allocations. Water recycling at 130% of single-occupant levels." Her eyes narrowed. "Explanation." Marcus moved to stand beside Sella, deliberately placing himself between her and the security personnel. "I found her," he said simply. She needed help. The officer's expression hardened. Station protocols are clear. During emergency preservation mode, all resources are allocated based on registered personnel only. Harboring unauthorized individuals constitutes theft of station resources. She would have died, Marcus said, fighting to keep his voice steady. That is not your concern. Engineer Kumar, the officer replied. Her use of his surname and title, a reminder of the hierarchy that had once governed the station. A hierarchy that should have died with the evacuation, but apparently lingered on in pockets of survivors like these security personnel. Your authorization grants you personal survival rights, not distribution authority. Marcus felt Sella's hand touch his. A brief moment of contact that conveyed solidarity stronger than words could have. Are you running a laboratory? The male guard asked suddenly. His eyes fixed on the workbench, where components and tools were scattered across the surface. Is that what this is? Some kind of experiment on the specimen? The casual dehumanization in the guard's words ignited something in Marcus that 16 months of isolation had buried. Anger. Righteous, burning anger at a system that had reduced people to resources, that had abandoned the vulnerable, that had prioritized protocol over compassion. Her name is Sella, he said, his voice low and dangerous even to his own ears. She is a person, not a specimen, and she stays with me. The officer's hand moved to her shock baton. This is not a negotiation. Engineer. The unauthorized individual will be removed for processing according to station protocols. Processing, Marcus repeated. The euphemism transparent after Sella's revelations about the facilities where Vathari had been held. You mean harvesting, using her for parts. A flicker of surprise crossed the officer's face, quickly replaced by professional indifference. I mean processing according to station protocols, she repeated. Step aside, engineer. No. The word hung in the air, simple and immovable as a mountain. Marcus felt Sella's tendrils brush against his arm, a gesture of support that strengthened his resolve. This is my assigned compartment, he continued, gaining confidence with each word. I have authorization for Emergency Bay 4. I choose who enters, who stays. Override protocols, the officer began, but Marcus cut her off. Only apply during immediate life-threatening emergencies. He finished for her. Current situation classification, humanitarian exception. The officer's eyes narrowed. There are no humanitarian exceptions in emergency preservation mode. Check the charter, Marcus insisted. Section 7, paragraph 12. In cases where immediate humanitarian action is required to preserve life, station personnel may temporarily suspend resource allocation protocols with proper documentation of necessity. He was bluffing. He had no idea if such a provision existed in the station charter. But he knew the security personnel wouldn't know either. They followed orders and enforced protocols. They didn't write them. The officer hesitated, then touched her wrist communicator. Control. Verify Charter Section 7, Paragraph 12. Humanitarian exceptions. There was a long pause, during which Marcus held his breath and tried to project more confidence than he felt. Beside him, Sella stood perfectly still, her tendrils the only movement, rippling slightly with tension. Finally, the communicator crackled. Section 7, Paragraph 12 confirmed. Humanitarian exceptions permitted with documentation and supervisor approval. The officer's face hardened with frustration. There are no supervisors left to approve. I'll take responsibility. Marcus interrupted. Full documentation, my authorization code, my resource allocation. He met her gaze without flinching. She knocked. I opened. Everything else is bureaucracy. The simple statement seemed to affect the officer more than his earlier arguments. She stared at him for a long moment, then at Sella, her expression unreadable. Why? She finally asked. The question stripped of official formality. Why risk your survival for—" She gestured at Sella, still unable to see her as a person, rather than an unauthorized presence. Marcus thought about the hollow space 16 months of solitude had carved inside him, about the way Sella's presence had begun to fill it, about the difference between surviving and living. "Because she's alive," he said simply. "Because she deserves to be." The officer studied him, then shook her head slightly, as if dismissing a troubling thought. When she spoke again, her voice had regained its official tone. "Humanitarian exception noted in the record. The unauthorized—" She stopped, visibly corrected herself. "The Vathari may remain in Emergency Bay 4 under your authorization. Engineer Kumar, resource allocation will be adjusted accordingly from your personal allowance." Her eyes hardened again. "But be aware that this exception does not extend beyond this compartment. If either of you are found in restricted areas, standard protocols will apply." Marcus nodded, knowing this was the best outcome they could hope for. "Understood." The officer gestured to the guard, and both backed toward the door. "We'll be conducting regular checks," she warned as the door began to slide closed. "Documentation must be maintained." Then they were gone, the door sealing behind them with a hiss of equalizing pressure. For a long moment, Marcus and Sella stood frozen, hardly daring to believe the confrontation was over. Then, Sella's tendrils rippled in a complex pattern Marcus had never seen before, and she turned to him with something like wonder in her black eyes. "You protected," she said, her voice soft with disbelief. "Against your own kind." Marcus shook his head. "They're not my kind," he said firmly. "Not if they can look at a person suffering and see only a protocol violation." Sella's tendrils continued their rippling movement, which Marcus was beginning to suspect might be the Vathari equivalent of tears, an emotional release with no physical component visible to human eyes. "They will return," she said, a statement rather than a question. "Yes," Marcus agreed. "But they'll follow protocol now. Document, inspect, report. They won't take you." He hesitated, then added, "I can't promise you'll be safe forever. I don't know how long the station will last, or what will happen when other systems fail." Sella's tendrils stilled, and she regarded him with those unfathomable black eyes. "Do not promise safety," she agreed. "Promise presence." The simple request struck Marcus like a physical blow, not a demand for protection he couldn't guarantee, or for solutions he didn't have. Just presence, being there, whatever came. "I promise," he said, the words emerging rough with emotion. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Sella nodded, accepting this promise as sufficient. Then, with the same fluid grace that characterized all her movements, she reached out and took his hand in hers. The touch was deliberate this time, not the brief contact of earlier, but a sustained connection. "Together," she echoed, her cool fingers intertwined with his warm ones, the physical embodiment of their unlikely alliance. The days that followed took on a new rhythm. They continued their work maintaining the station's vital systems. But now, with the added task of documenting everything for the security personnel's regular inspections, Marcus found himself appreciating the discipline this imposed. Keeping records helped him track resource usage more efficiently, allowing them to stretch supplies further than he'd thought possible. Security came every third cycle, always the same officer and guard, always with the same cold efficiency. They checked documentation, verified resource allocations, and departed without unnecessary interaction. If they noticed the small improvements in the living space, the second cot salvaged from another medical bay, the privacy screen constructed from spare panels, the attempt at decoration in the form of reconfigured lighting that cast gentle patterns across the walls, they made no comment. Sella no longer hid when they came. She stood beside Marcus, her tendrils calm, her black eyes meeting theirs without flinching. A small victory in a world of losses. The station continued its slow decline. Systems failed and were repaired. Air grew thinner and was supplemented by reserves Marcus had discovered in sealed compartments Sela could access through maintenance tunnels. Water recyclers broke down and were reconfigured to operate at lower efficiency but greater stability. Through it all, Marcus and Sela worked side by side, their partnership evolving into something deeper than mere survival cooperation. They began to share stories in the quiet hours between emergencies. Marcus spoke of Earth before the crisis, of green fields and blue skies, of bustling cities and quiet wilderness. Sela described her homeworld, a place of perpetual twilight, where the Vathari had evolved to see beauty in shadows and find comfort in darkness. They spoke of families lost, Marcus's parents and sister, presumably safe on one of the evacuation ships but forever beyond his reach. Sela's communal group, separated during the relocations, their fates unknown but feared. They shared dreams, hesitantly at first, then with increasing openness, dreams of finding others like themselves, of rebuilding something from the ruins of their respective worlds, of a future beyond mere survival. And in those shared stories and dreams, the hollow space inside Marcus continued to fill, not with a temporary distraction of purpose, but with something more enduring: connection, understanding, perhaps even the beginnings of love, though neither had words for it yet. It was during one of these quiet conversations, nearly a month after the security confrontation, that Sela revealed the final piece of her story. They sat side by side on Marcus's cot, watching the patterns of light his reconfigured emergency lamps cast across the wall, a simulation of twilight that reminded Sela of home. Her tendrils moved gently in the artificial breeze from the ventilation system, and for once, her black eyes weren't scanning for threats, but were fixed contemplatively on the dancing lights. "I did not tell all truth," she said suddenly, her voice soft but clear in the quiet compartment. "About why I revealed myself to you." Marcus turned to look at her, surprised, but not alarmed. Trust between them had grown strong enough to withstand secrets. "What didn't you tell me?" Sela's tendrils curled inward slightly, a gesture he now recognized as nervousness or uncertainty. Air thinning, systems failing, loneliness, all true reasons. Her hand moved to rest on her abdomen, a gesture he'd noticed before, but hadn't assigned significance to. "But not only reasons." Marcus waited, giving her space to find the words at her own pace. "At the facility," she continued, her voice dropping even lower, "they did not only harvest organs, they took reproductive material for study, for experiments." Her tendrils flattened completely against her skull, a sign of deep distress. "Before escape, I discovered changes inside." Understanding dawned slowly, then hit Marcus with the force of a physical blow. "You're pregnant," he whispered. Sela nodded, her black eyes finally meeting his. "Carrying life. Unknown father. Unknown genetics. Perhaps pure Vathari. Perhaps—" She trailed off, unable to voice the alternative. "Hybrid," Marcus finished for her, the implications staggering. If the scientists at the facility had been experimenting with cross-species reproduction— "Yes," Sela confirmed. "Unknown development pattern, unknown needs." Her hand pressed more firmly against her abdomen. Needed help, medical knowledge. Could not birth alone in walls, in darkness. The trust implied in her revelation left Marcus breathless. She had come to him not just for shelter or companionship, but with the most vulnerable possible need: help bringing new life into their broken world. "I don't know how to help," he admitted, the inadequacy of his medical knowledge a sudden, glaring deficiency. "I'm not a doctor. I don't understand Vathari physiology, let alone—" He gestured helplessly toward her abdomen, Not asking for doctor, Sella said, her tendrils relaxing slightly. Asking for presence, for not being alone when time comes. There it was again. That simple request that cut through all complications to the heart of human, and apparently Vithari need. Not for solutions or guarantees, but for connection. For someone to witness, to share, to simply be there. When? Marcus asked, already mentally cataloging the medical supplies available in the emergency bay, wondering what could be repurposed for obstetric use. Soon, Sella replied, her tendrils rippling with what might have been anxiety or anticipation. Feel changes, quickening movements, pressure building. Marcus nodded, his mind racing through scenarios, preparations, potential complications. We'll need to gather supplies, convert the privacy screen into a birthing area, find medical references in the database that might help, even if they're for human pregnancies. He looked around the compartment, seeing it with new eyes, not just as a survival space, but as a potential birthplace. We'll make it as safe as possible. Sella's tendrils rippled again, this time in what he recognized as relief. Gratitude, she said formally, then with a softer tone. Not afraid now, not alone. Marcus reached out hesitantly, his hand hovering over hers, where it rested on her abdomen. May I? Sella nodded, taking his hand and guiding it to the slight swell beneath the jumpsuit. At first, Marcus felt nothing but the firm curve of her stomach. Then, a flutter beneath his palm. A definite movement. A shifting pressure that could only be a tiny limb or body part pressing against the confines of its world. Oh, he breathed, wonder replacing anxiety in an instant. Hello there. Sella's tendrils rippled in what he now knew was joy. Pure, unguarded joy. Life, she whispered. New beginning. Marcus looked up from his hand on her abdomen to her face, seeing in those alien features an expression unmistakable across species barriers. Hope. Pure, defiant hope in the face of overwhelming odds. A new beginning, he agreed, the words a promise and a prayer. For all of us. In the days that followed, their preparations took on a new urgency. The second cot was modified into a birthing bed, with adjustable positions and sanitized surfaces. The privacy screen was reinforced and extended to create a dedicated medical area within their living space. Marcus scoured the station's database for any information on Vithari physiology, finding pitifully little, but supplementing it with general xenobiology principles and human obstetric practices that might apply. Sella contributed her own knowledge of Vithari birthing traditions, describing the communal support structures that normally surrounded a birthing parent, the circle of caregivers, the songs sung to ease labor pains, the ceremonial welcomes prepared for the new life. Together, they adapted these traditions for their two-person community, creating a hybrid approach that honored her heritage while acknowledging their limitations. Throughout these preparations, the security personnel continued their regular inspections. If they noticed the medical modifications to the living space, they made no comment. If they observed Sella's changing body beneath the increasingly ill-fitting jumpsuit, they recorded no observations. Their willful blindness was a blessing Marcus hadn't anticipated, but gratefully accepted. The birth, when it came, arrived with the same unpredictability as Sella herself had. A knock at the door of Marcus's carefully ordered existence, demanding entry without warning or preparation. He woke to the sound of soft keening, a melodic but clearly pained vocalization, unlike anything he'd heard from Sella before. She stood beside her cot, tendrils writhing in complex patterns, her hands pressed against the small of her back. "It begins," she said simply when she saw him awake. No fear in her voice, just a calm acceptance of the inevitable process her body had initiated. Marcus was on his feet instantly, all their preparations suddenly seeming inadequate in the face of the actual event. "What do you need? What can I do?" Sella's tendrils rippled in what might have been amusement, despite her discomfort. "Be present," she reminded him. "All else follows pattern older than both our species." Over the next 14 hours, Marcus learned the truth of her words. Birth did indeed follow ancient patterns, a choreography written in the genetic code of all living things. Sella moved through its stages with instinctive grace, alternating between periods of intense concentration and brief moments of rest. Marcus remained by her side throughout, offering physical support when needed, respecting her space when she required solitude, adapting to her changing needs with the same flexibility that had characterized their entire relationship. He spoke little, understanding that his presence rather than his words provided the comfort she sought. When the final stage arrived, Sella assumed a position unlike any Marcus had seen in human birthing records. A semi-crouching stance, supported by her arms, her body creating a protected space beneath it. Her tendrils stood fully erect around her head, vibrating with tension and purpose. "Stand ready," she instructed Marcus, her voice strained but steady. "Receive new life." Marcus positioned himself as directed, hands clean and waiting, heart pounding with equal parts terror and anticipation. For one suspended moment, the universe seemed to hold its breath along with him. Then, with a final keening cry that resonated through the compartment like a struck bell, Sella brought forth new life into their broken world. The infant slid into Marcus's waiting hands, impossibly small and slick with birth fluids. Human in basic form, 2 arms, 2 legs, a recognizably humanoid face, but with unmistakable Vathari characteristics. Skin, a pale grayish blue, delicate tendrils where hair would be on a human child, eyes large and entirely black when they briefly fluttered open. "A daughter," Marcus whispered, awe making his voice tremble. "Sella, you have a daughter." Sella sank to her knees, exhaustion evident in every line of her body, but her tendrils rippling with joy. She reached for the child, and Marcus carefully transferred the tiny being into her mother's arms. The moment of connection between mother and child transcended species barriers, cultural differences, and the broken world around them. Sella's tendrils gently touched the infants, an intimate greeting Marcus felt privileged to witness. The baby's tiny tendrils responded, curling instinctively toward her mother's in a dance as old as Vathari existence. "She is perfect," Sella said, wonder softening her voice to a caress. "A miracle in darkness." Marcus knelt beside them, overwhelmed by the significance of what they had achieved together. Not just the birth itself, but the creation of hope in a place where none should exist. Life continuing, evolving, finding new expressions even as old worlds died. "What will you name her?" he asked softly, reluctant to break the sacred quiet that had descended on their small sanctuary. Sella considered the question, her tendrils moving in contemplative patterns. "In Vathari tradition, community names child together," she explained. "All who witness birth contribute sound, meaning." She looked up at Marcus, those black eyes reflecting the gentle patterns of light he'd created for her. "You witnessed, you contribute." The responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a mantle, heavy but welcome. "I'm honored," he said truthfully. "But I don't know Vathari naming conventions." "No conventions now," Sella replied, her tendrils rippling with what might have been resignation or acceptance. Old world gone, new world forming. She gestured to the station around them, to their makeshift home within it. "New traditions begin here, with us." Marcus looked at the infant, now sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, untroubled by the precariousness of her existence or the weight of symbolism her birth carried. A child of 2 worlds, belonging fully to neither yet embodying hope for both. "Aurora," he suggested softly. "It means dawn in an ancient earth language, the light that comes after the darkest hour, promising a new day." Sella's tendrils rippled in consideration, then settled into a pattern Marcus recognized as approval. Aurora, she repeated, the name musical in her mouth. Dawnlight. She touched her daughter's tiny tendrils gently. I contribute also, Seleth, meaning resilient one in Vithari. Aurora Seleth, Marcus said, testing the combination. The resilient dawn. Sella nodded, satisfied with their creation. A name worthy of her journey, of our journey together. In that moment, looking at mother and child bathed in the gentle twilight of his reconfigured emergency lights, Marcus felt the last of the hollow space inside him fill completely. The station was still dying around them. Resources were still dwindling. The future remained uncertain in every possible way. But they were no longer just surviving. They were living, creating, building something new from the ruins of what had been lost. A family, unconventional but real. A home, makeshift but warm. A future, uncertain but facing together. I'll help you raise her, Marcus promised, the words emerging without conscious thought, but carrying absolute certainty. Whatever comes, whatever challenges, whatever joy or sorrow, we'll face it as a family. Sella's tendrils rippled with emotion too complex for human understanding. But her eyes, when she raised them to meet his, contained a message unmistakable across all species barriers. Love, gratitude, and absolute trust. Family, she agreed, the word holding all the promise of new worlds waiting to be born. Together. Outside their sanctuary, the emergency lights continued their erratic rhythm. 3 flashes, then darkness. 2 flashes, then darkness. But within, a new light had kindled, steadier, warmer, and infinitely more precious than any technological salvation. Aurora Seleth, the resilient dawn, slept peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware that her very existence had transformed a dying station into something else entirely, a beginning. Marcus sat beside Sella, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, and for the first time since the evacuation, felt not just the will to survive, but the joy of being alive. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as they had faced everything else since that first knock on his door, together. Neither home, nor clothes, nor hope, until a human opened the door and said, "Stay forever inside." Now, they had all 3, created from nothing but trust, compassion, and the unbreakable bond forged between souls who refused to let darkness have the final word.